Hello and welcome back to the Insights of NetSupport podcast, Corporate Edition. I'm your host, Cauchi, and today I'm really excited to welcome Veronica onto the show. Hi, Veronica. How are you?
Hi, Kat. I'm great. Hello from Hong Kong. Very excited to be with you
Hi.
today.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'm really glad that we managed to find a time that worked for us both. So that's really great. How's your week been so far?
It's been great, but I'll talk about cultural agility today. One of the challenges of cultural agility is managing different time zones. So this week I had
Yes.
calls at 6 a.m. Ecuador, at night with the US. So good trying to manage what it means working in a multicultural business.
Absolutely, yeah. So that is one that we can bear in mind for later then when we get into that. So would you mind starting by introducing yourself to our listeners, please?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, and I'm a public speaker as well as a published author. I just published my third book, which is one of my passions.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And in terms of my areas of expertise is really on inclusive leadership, anything that has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but particularly on cultural agility side, because it's the story of my life, it's my background. We will go into it, but that's really my area of passion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you mentioned when we were kind of doing our email exchanges that you speak 6 different languages and you've been learning them since you were a kid. And obviously that's part of your story with that, with the cultural agility. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And it's a nice way to explain a little bit more about my background. So I'm
Yeah, definitely.
from Spain. I was born in the Canary Islands, some little islands next to Africa. And when I was 5 years old, we moved to France because of my dad's job. And so
Mhm.
that was my first experience moving to a different country. I didn't speak the language, I didn't understand the
Mm.
culture, but I remember being very scared as a little girl going into this school where no one
Mm.
spoke the language and being
Yeah.
very aware of what it felt and what it meant to be excluded.
Mm.
And so I learned French, and not
Mm.
only that, I tried my best to sound just like the French kids so that I would really feel that I belonged.
Mm.
Then, when I was 11 years old, we moved to Rio in Brazil. And same
Mm.
story, they spoke Portuguese. So I went to a French Portuguese or Brazilian school,
Mm.
and I had to learn my third language. After that, we moved to the Netherlands, and it's only at age 15 where I started learning English, and in the Netherlands, where English is not
Yeah.
even the first language. So,
Mhm.
so that was how I continued into this journey of language learning. And later in life, I moved to Italy to study. So I studied in the University of Bologna. That's how I learned my fifth language. And
Mhm.
then a long time ago, so in 2003, I moved, I left with a one-way ticket and a purple suitcase to Taiwan and later
Oh,
on
wow.
China to learn
Mhm.
Chinese. And so that's really the story of how I got to learn 6 languages. And it's funny because
Yeah.
very often people tell me, "You're so talented." But in reality, it's really a combination of the life experience, the opportunities that I
Mm.
had, and also a lot of effort. I learned
Yeah.
Chinese because I spent so many hours, and even after 20 years living in Greater
Mhm.
China and now living in Hong Kong, I still study Chinese every week. So there's a lot of
Yeah, of
effort.
course.
There is some talent, but
So
definitely a
much
lot
to
of
it,
effort.
isn't there? It's quite a big language. It's like there's a lot to learn. So, do you think that because you started learning when you were a child as well, that made it easier for you to then learn languages as you got older?
Definitely. I mean, and there is science and research that proves that when you learn languages as a child, your brain develops in a way that it makes it much easier afterwards to absorb
Mm.
languages. And it was definitely my experience because what I notice is that children, they don't really question why a language is a certain way. They have a
Mm.
very open mind. Whereas adults, and I see this when adults are trying to learn a second language for the first time, they are trying to translate word by word from language A to language B. And that leads to a
Mm.
lot of frustration, to a lot of misunderstanding, because languages, they're ways of communicating, but they're definitely not replicas or copy paste of each other. And it goes to show how when we are little children, we just have like this open mind. We're open to the world. We're
Yeah.
open to explore. We're not trying to question why this word is said in a different way. They just learn. So I can definitely also confirm from experience that it was much
Mm.
easier learning languages as a child than it was
Mm.
as an adult.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you've also lived in 9 countries. What has that experience been like for you? And obviously, I know some of that was when your parents were moving around and things like that. But even after that, you continued. I mean, you're in Hong Kong right now. Yeah. So what's that experience been like, and what drew you to carrying on with living in different countries?
So the first thing is, what was that experience like? For me, it was normal. And
Mm.
that's what I lived when I was a child. So I always really struggled when people told me that they lived their entire life in a place. It was such
Yeah.
a weird thing for me to think about, or even as an adult, when people tell me, where are you going to settle down? I never had
Mm.
this concept. I never had a house that was my own until I became an adult many, many years later. And so that was my normal. And
Yeah.
what I think is wonderful about living in so many places, especially when you do it from a young age, is that you develop the concept of having homes in different places. Like for me, if I go to Brazil, I kind of switch on to a different channel and I still have a lot of friends there and I speak
Mm.
Portuguese. And I feel very much that I'm from there. And even if I was to go to China, it's a place that was really special for me. I spent a few years
Mm.
there. I speak Chinese as well, and so I'm able to really find home in different places. One question that
Yeah.
people ask
Amazing.
all the time, and I'm gonna address it because probably someone in the audience is thinking about it. They ask me,
Mm.
"Where would your favorite country to live in?" I get this question all the
Mm.
time, so I had to think about it. And my answer is there's not one country. I think life evolves and you have phases. And I
Mm.
loved growing up in France when I was a kid, and I love living in Italy when I was older. But I think when you have a growth mindset, you don't think in terms of better, you think in terms of adding. Every time
Mm.
I'm in a country, I'm thinking, what can I learn from this? How can I gain from it? During the
Yeah.
pandemic, for example, I was locked abroad due to the regulations and the quarantine and so on.
Yeah. Cool.
So I left with my daughters, two little girls, and I thought I was going on holidays, but in the end,
Mm.
we ended up staying in Australia for over a year while my
Wow.
husband and my dog were here.
Gosh.
And I was in Australia. I loved it living there. And
Mm.
people all the time, oh, but what do you prefer, Hong Kong or Australia? And for
Mm.
me, there's no point in comparing. It's like
It'll be such a
comparing.
different experience in
Yeah,
each country, though. So just it's like chalk and cheese trying to compare them, isn't it?
exactly.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, I guess it makes sense a bit, you've all kind of since you were little, you've always done that. So the concept of staying somewhere forever must be the more unusual thing, like you say. Um, so you mentioned before that you're an advocate for cultural agility. So before we talk a little bit more about that, could you just explain what that means for anyone that's kind of a bit thrown by the term?
Yes, and sometimes we throw these jargons in any
Yeah.
industry. In my case, in DEI, even a lot of people don't even know that DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Cultural agility, if you explain in very simple terms, is just being open to the fact that there are other cultures. Is being
Mhm.
open to the fact that, for example, English is my second language. So if I make a
Yeah.
mistake today, is about having that empathy, or is maybe
Mm,
understanding that now we're going into Christmas period and some people don't celebrate Christmas, but some people do. So it's really
exactly.
making room for cultures. It's as simple as
Mm,
that. And in order to do that, we have to be very agile. We have to have an open mindset. There are many things that
mm.
we don't know. There are many things that we don't understand. But rather than judging or looking at it with our own cultural lens, it's just trying to remove all of this judgment and make room for other cultures.
Yeah, no, that's a really great way to put it. And I guess it's kind of tapping into that mindset of a child again, where you were talking about before how you're so open and you don't really question things and you just kind of accept more. Um, that would really help with that. So, how can employees and their employers develop cultural agility?
Mhm. So the first thing is to be curious. I think there's an element of learning. There's an element of being curious, asking, educating yourself. Like, for example, if you're moving to a different country, be curious about the traditions. Be curious about what people eat. I think food is a very good example on where we don't see cultural agility. And I'm going to speak for
Mm,
myself. When I moved to China, so this was many years ago, and I went to the local restaurants, I saw things that Chinese people ate that I just found at the time disgusting, like, oh, how can they eat this? I would never eat something like that. When in reality, it's just a different culture. It's just
yeah.
a different way of doing things. There are things that we
Mhm.
eat, or the French eating snails, for example, or in Spain, we eat the heads of the shrimp that people
Mm,
might that it's disgusting. And so I
mm,
think that's a very good example on how we just have to try to remove these filters. One
mm,
example completely changed my mind was drinking hot water in China. So this is something
mhm.
very common in China and in many parts of North Asia. Very often
Okay.
you go to a restaurant or even when you visit a client and if they offer you water, especially if it's cold in winter, they will give you hot
It'll be
water.
hot.
At the beginning, I thought that that was such a strange thing to do. And I was
Mm,
like, why would I drink hot water? But then I started to do it very often because it was the only thing available. And
yeah,
I
of
really
course.
started to feel that it was such a great thing. It was good for the
Mm,
body. It felt good.
mm.
Apparently, actually much better to drink things that are more
Yeah, isn't
closer
it
to.
much better to have it closer to your body temperature, isn't it, rather than something that's too cold or too hot?
Yes. So that's the point number one is about
Mm,
being curious. And the point number two is about not judging. There are
mm,
ways of behaving or even the way that we greet is very different. For example, in
mm,
Spain and in like more Latin countries, we are very tactile, we're very physical. Even if it's someone that you haven't really met before, you might, in some countries, you might give two kisses, you might shake a hand, you might give a hug. All of this much more
mm.
uh, physical body contact. In Asia, people would look at you, especially if it's a man that has never been introduced to a woman and goes and gives a hug or two kisses, as very
Yeah.
invasive. So they might do a
Mm,
poem as something much more with more distance that might seem more formal or even cold.
mhm,
Not cold, it's just part of the culture. So I think that that second point is about not
mhm,
judging, and the third one is really making
mm.
room for everyone to speak. And I think in the work environment, that is huge because very often,
Yeah.
if an individual comes from an underrepresented group, and by that I mean it could be a different culture, it could be that English is your second language, it could be that your religion is different, you already
Mm,
feel much more intimidated to put your hand up. And it was
mm.
definitely my experience when I used to work at Apple. In my team, it was very male dominated. I was the
Yeah.
only woman. And I remember
Mm,
feeling that I was the only woman. And so, as a
mm,
leader, is how you make room for everyone, is how you go around the table and you ask things like, whom
mm,
haven't we heard from? Or, for example, if it's virtual meetings, what I tended to do very often, if we were using Zoom, for example, is invite people to participate using the chat rather than
mm.
having to speak in front of 20
Yeah.
people, 30 people. So, giving options for people to express themselves. And this could
Mm,
be asking everyone, it could be maybe checking with people after the meeting, depending of course on the scale of the meeting, but making sure
mm.
that everyone's voice is heard. So I think this third one, so to summarize, is that that curiosity of asking, of
Yeah.
educating yourself. The second piece is about not judging, and the third one is making room for everyone so that everyone's voice can be heard.
Yeah, no, those are three really key points. Thank you. It's interesting as well what you were saying about like different ways of greeting and things like that. I noticed that from I've been to Japan quite a few times, and again, it's kind of similar in that very physical contact would be very very invasive. So yeah, it is interesting, and I think yeah, it's kind of not, like you say, not judging that and just accepting different cultures and different ways of doing things. It's really interesting, and asking questions. I tend to find it fascinating, actually, to be honest, to kind of different elements of different cultures and how people do things and stuff. Um, so, what are the opportunities and the challenges of managing a multicultural team?
I think we can first talk about the challenges because that's the first thing that we usually come across. And the challenges is very often that when you're managing a multicultural team, by nature, you're going to hear more from the people who are the majority, whether it's men
Mm,
or whether it's people for whom English is a first language, or whether it's just the majority of the demographic because they already feel that they belong. And so making little tweaks, so we're going to talk opportunities or challenges and opportunities.
mhm,
So making little tweaks to make sure that everyone feels that they belong can make a
mm,
huge impact. One mistake that I made, because I think that's very often how we learn as well, by making mistakes and
yeah.
afterwards reflecting on them, is that I worked for this organization where we had to do a whole strategy on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And after the strategy, the leaders had to cascade it to their teams. And so
Mm,
we agreed that the best way to do it was to have like some informal breakfast sessions during
mhm,
which the leaders would be informing the teams. They would cascade information, and there would be some time for Q&A. So we did those sessions, and the feedback was really positive from most of the
mhm.
people, except that we hosted this during the Ramadan month. And
Uh,
exactly. And so there was a small
mhm,
proportion, but still, of course, even if it's one
yeah.
person who felt
Trying
very
to
excluded,
fast forward a breakfast meeting.
it's always awkward
Mm,
when you're on behalf of the people who are
mhm,
eating and you're not. And for me, it's something that at that moment I didn't think about. Now it's very, very
mhm,
present in my mind. But a little tweak, like maybe changing the timing or not having food involved, could have been
mm,
a much better way of doing it. So that's one way. Other challenges is the how people, as I was saying, they're not really going to speak up if we don't make room for them. And so
mm,
one of the challenges, and again, learning by mistake, is that you might finish a meeting, and after you ask, do you have any questions, or you hear people's feedback, if it's a truly multicultural team, you might leave with the feeling that, oh, everybody agreed on this. When the reality is that very often there's a confirmation bias, or there's a group
mm.
bias, whereby you maybe have 20 people in a meeting, but three people are very vocal. They're the leading voices. They're the ones who are sharing the opinion.
You assume
And
everyone
the
else feels the same way.
either doesn't say anything, or
Mhm,
they agree because they're afraid to disagree. And that's a
mm.
big
Just
challenge when
nodding along, sort of. Yeah.
exactly when you're leaving a meeting thinking that you know what the group is thinking, but you don't. You know what these three people said.
Mm,
And it's very important to have that awareness. So if you're not able to hear from everyone, first try to create mechanisms where you can by encouraging. Very often, I would say, especially myself, English is not my first language. If it's not your first language, don't worry about how you're going to sound. Just share your idea, feel
mm,
comfortable. It's not an English class.
yeah.
And try to get feedback afterwards. There's so many ways. You can have a poll during the session.
Mm,
You can have feedback afterward. You can have anonymous feedback. One thing that I found that works very well when I'm delivering a presentation is have a word cloud, or
mm,
when you ask questions and people anonymously are able to reply. So I think
yeah.
that's a good way to give people a voice.
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes so much sense. So what are some of your top tips for managing a multicultural team effectively?
So I think the number one is to have that curiosity, and that curiosity is not only the informal, oh, I'm going to ask colleagues or here and there, but it's also about reading and informing yourself. And one thing that I love doing, for example, is understanding more about people who have a very different lived experience from mine. So how I
Mm,
do it is by, especially on social media, I'm very active on LinkedIn. I follow
mhm,
people who have disability, and they create a lot of content around disability. And honestly, I've been able to learn so much about digital accessibility, how to content in a way that is accessible for people who have a visual impairment or people who are blind. So educating yourself informally but also formally. There are so many resources out there, books, movies, not always watching the movies, the Hollywood movies from the same people, but also try to mix it up so that you really
Yeah.
understand other cultures and so on. So I think educating yourself is a great one. Connecting with the team. I think when you have a one-to-one with your team, try to find out a little bit more about them in their life, because that always gives you a sense of what really matters for them. And if, for example, someone is very religious and they go to a church on a Sunday, and it's a retail company where you're supposed to work on Sundays, how do you make those adjustments for
Yeah.
people to to do the things that really matter to them? So I think that's also really important, like really connect with people in that topic. But it's a very, very important tip that a lot of people get wrong, including myself, is the importance of names. The
Mm.
thing that defines someone's identity is their name. And there's
Mm.
research, scientific research, that proves that when you're talking to someone and I say, "Hey, Kat, it's a pleasure to be here today," it actually produces positivity for you. It is like positivity because you feel good, you feel valued, you feel important. Now,
Mm.
that's very easy when it's a name that you're used to pronounce, it's a name that is common in your language. But I can tell you that many languages, they have names that for me are very difficult to pronounce. For
Mm.
example, whether these names or Thai names. And what I have seen people do, leaders do, is if there's a very long name that is difficult to pronounce, they might call that person, "Hey, I'm going to call you Kate," because the name
Mm.
is very long and difficult to pronounce without asking, or
Mm.
pronouncing without checking. And
That
just
it
a
was
little
correct. Yeah.
thing. Yes, and I get that very often with my family name Llorca. A lot of
Mm.
people don't know how to pronounce it, and very often
Yeah.
they ask, "Am I saying this correctly?" So that
Mhm.
makes me feel valued. And even if
Yeah.
afterwards they don't pronounce it correctly, it doesn't matter because it's about
At least it
having that
will. Yeah.
positive.
I have it with Cauchi as well. Like it's always mispronounced, but it's really nice when people check and say, "Is that right? Is that how you say it?" I mean, that's fine. But yeah, like you say, when people kind of just don't really care or they just try and avoid it or whatever, it just makes
Yeah.
you feel a bit, yeah, you don't get that value, do you?
Exactly. So, in terms of tips, I want to make it as actionable as possible. And this is more relevant for
Mm.
people who work in not only multicultural team, but across different countries and different
Yeah.
continents. And it's being aware of the time difference.
Mm.
When I was working in the corporate world and I was working with New York, but based in Hong Kong with a team in Asia
Mhm.
Pacific, we would often have calls that were scheduled by New York at 8 p.m. here in the evening because we have a difference of 12 or 13 hours, depending.
Mm.
Teams would have to have these extremely long days without never really having a break,
Yeah.
because it was always Asia, the region, that tends to suffer because we are ahead.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so it's difficult to get a time zone that works for everyone, especially
Mm.
if you're working with New York, the US, with Europe, with Asia.
Yeah.
But being aware, and if it has to happen, then how do you mitigate it? How do you make sure that people only attend if they really have to? Is there a chance, and we did this, Australia is
Mm.
even later than us, is there a way that we can
Yeah.
record the calls so that they catch them later? But being aware, and I'm very aware that for you, Kat, is the morning
Mm.
now. For me, it's the afternoon. When I join a podcast, I always say good morning, good evening, depending on where you are, because cultural agility is understanding that our world is bigger than my room.
It's different. Yeah. No, whenever I work with, quite a few members of the staff in the US team as well, and I'm always trying to be really mindful with time of, like, checking, like, so it's this time here, so it's that time there. Okay, trying to find, like you say, that middle ground or I mean, I guess it's things like as well, if you had to have that call really late to talk to that team, could you be allowed to start a bit later that day to make up for it, so you're not doing such a long day, you know? I guess it's making considerations like that, isn't it?
We are talking about agility, so it's really being agile and finding options
Yeah.
that can work for people. And I think one of the only good things that COVID brought is that we're all more agile when it comes to things like working from home, leveraging technology, being able to do many more things online. So I think that's one of them,
Definitely.
being agile with time zones.
Brilliant. So the last main thing I wanted to ask you was, how can managers ensure that all of their team feel included?
So the first thing when we talk about inclusion is we can only make sure that people are included when they tell us. Me talking about inclusion or doing a workshop on inclusion, it means nothing if we don't know the impact that it makes. So I think the first thing is to get insights from your team. What is missing, whether it's a more formal survey or employee net promoter scores, where you can really get insights on
Mm.
what people are feeling, what is missing, and understanding, trying to get that data and be very, very precise. Because if people are not feeling included, it can be many different things. It's not as obvious as, oh, I'm feeling excluded in a meeting. When I've worked with
Mm.
companies, very often one of the reasons that employees say that they don't feel included is because they say that there's no transparency. So that
Mm.
transparency could be in the way decisions are communicated. That transparency could be in how promotions are made or in how hiring happens. And so this is
Mhm.
another example on where you want to make sure that you understand where that inclusion, or in this case, lack of inclusion happens. And you can only
Mm.
get that if you talk to people. Now, how you can talk to people, you can have one-to-one conversations, you can have anonymous surveys. What I found that works very well as well is to have focus groups. And
Mhm.
you can, it does work better when you do it with external companies, because if you're doing
Yeah.
a focus group and you're the manager, there's a bit of a conflict of interest. People are not going to
Yeah, of
be
course. People might be less open as well, whereas with an external company, they probably feel more comfortable sharing how they really feel.
exactly. So, as a consultant, I've done projects where I'm the one who is hosting
Mm.
these focus groups, and people are very open. They're very vocal. They share where they are, we're not feeling included, and it could
Mm.
be a lot of different things. So, just to give a few examples, we talked about transparency. It could be about
Mm.
language. The way that we use language very often is not inclusive. We might use language in a way that is not gender.
Mm.
For example, when we are describing
Yep.
a CV, for example, or when we're talking about
Mhm.
chairman, or when we're talking about anything else, really, like there's a lot
Yeah.
of bias in the
Mm.
language. So I think getting that
Absolutely.
feedback from the managers is really important. That's really number one, understanding what you're trying to solve for. Because saying that I want people to feel included without knowing where they're not feeling included is almost like throwing a ball with a blind eyes.
Mhm.
So you really have to understand what you're trying to solve, and then
Mhm.
it's tackling that both from a very organic way. Every time you have meetings, how do you say collaborative ground rules, so that everyone participates, everyone
Mm.
feels that they're going to be judged. So setting those ground rules collaboratively is a fantastic exercise. I do it almost every time that I run a workshop. We start by saying,
Yeah.
what are the collaborative ground rules? Everyone participates. Every idea is a good idea. We want to hear from 100% of the group, whatever that is.
Mm.
But there are a lot of ways that you can run this organically. And then it's also very important for companies to invest in this. If you're
Mm.
investing in your business and your business is run by people, you have to make sure that you're investing in their development, and you're also investing in people feeling included and feeling
Yeah.
that they belong. And a lot of that, it doesn't happen organically, because as I was saying at the beginning, I only know what I have lived. I cannot
Mm.
know what it is for a person who
Cool.
is from the LGBT community, because I
Mm.
haven't lived that. So I have to find ways to bridge that gap for me to understand it.
Mm.
And that's where training, but effective training, where it's really actionable. You get inspiration,
Yeah.
but it's actionable, and you have takeaways after it, and you have things that you can really implement. That type of training, I think, is very important, because you also need awareness first. You need the
Mm.
inspiration, you need the awareness piece, and only then you're able to implemented with a buy-in. Because if you
Mhm.
just impose things, if you just roll out policies, it's compliance. And compliance doesn't really last very long.
No.
You get people,
You won't get that retention from just compliance.
even the word is like, this is not gonna work.
It's not a nice word, compliance.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you,
So,
Veronica. It's been so amazing to talk to you today, and you've made so many great points. So the last thing I wanted to ask really is just where can our listeners best get in touch with you and learn more?
great. So they can find me in a lot of different places. The first place is on LinkedIn, where you can find me with my name there. So I'll pop up. I'm also a writer on Medium. So you can find me on Medium. I have my website, which is veronicalorcasmith.com. And these are the main channels.